Hey everybody, welcome to the introduction to Mesopotamia. You're going to see in just a second, you're going to get to a login page for an online resource that you can all log into using the same account. That is down at the bottom, right there. Username and password. Pause if you need to. If not, I'm going to continue. You'll see me log in myself right now. And again, you get the login information. Your username in all caps. Is no strex, and your password is KNOWS593. Let's log in and see. Let me choose the resource called Discovering Our Past, A History of the World. And right now we're beginning with chapter 4 and lesson or activity or section 1. Now, the first civilizations that we have ever seen and heard of didn't happen when we say Neolithic time period. Those were farming communities. They were still small. They didn't have a lot of the factors that make a civilization. But civilizations arose. You're living in a civilized world right now. So eventually they pop up in history. And here is where. If the Paleolithic period started about 2.5 million years ago, and it lasted until about 10,000 BC, that's a large chunk of time. The Paleolithic. The Neolithic time period, it occurred between 10,000 BC and 1000 BC. And during that time, the population exploded. And you see in blue text here, 6 million and then 25 million. That's what happened in the population from the beginning of the Neolithic age until the end. The population of the entire world tripled, over tripled actually. Now, the time period that we see civilizations begin to pop up is right here around 3000 BC. And you may say to yourself, that doesn't make any sense. That was still considered part of the Neolithic time period. And you're right. But because people were so secluded and separate from one another, they didn't interact. So civilizations were starting in places while people lived in a Neolithic lifestyle for quite a while yet, because they didn't hear about things like the wheel. They didn't hear about things like money. They didn't hear about things like irrigating land that is dry, but irrigating it to make it wet and farmable wasn't an idea that they got. You know, you didn't watch the news, you didn't text people or call people from far away and get their ideas like we do now. So the world was very separate. But Mesopotamia began, as you see here, about 3000 BC. Let me clear that out. And it happened in what's called river valleys. The same thing happened in Egypt, China, and India. And all throughout history, people have needed water. That has determined where they live, for drinking and growing crops. And although there were differences among early civilizations, they were alike in a lot of ways. In one way, and this actually is traced back to the Neolithic time period, we see the beginning of social classes. Right there, social classes. And this should look fairly familiar to things that you have heard and learned about. Social classes are when the society or the group of people living in one place together have differences in wealth, differences in power, differences in responsibilities, differences in freedoms sometimes, unfortunately. And this began in the Neolithic time period when there was a surplus. Some people think they worked harder and should get more than others. And that's how it is nowadays for us. We see in this picture something similar to what we experience in the US. An upper class of wealthy, an upper middle perhaps of fairly wealthy people, lower middle, again, most people, I think.
Gabe Coulter, please come to the office. Gabe Coulter, to the office, please.
Working class, working poor, and even those underclass. Very poor, very unfortunate people. This happened because of a surplus. And that is a Neolithic thing. So there's a little bit of a meshing of time periods here, and some concepts that you've learned about are continuing to surface, even though we discuss and call these civilizations. The social class that people belonged to depended on their job. Some jobs were seen as more important than others, kind of like today. A surgeon makes a little bit more money than most other jobs because what they do is quite important. The people of these civilizations, they also developed other systems such as values and beliefs. They started to wonder, why are we here? What's our purpose? And with that, you see the beginning of religion and faith and spirituality, asking the big question, what's our purpose here as people? We'll get into that more later. Now, Mesopotamia specifically started in a very, very, very dry and desert-like place. And I had just said that water is necessary. So, something needs to get figured out. If we start in Harrisburg, I'm going to zoom out and change the view to satellite and get rid of labels for the time being. Zooming out further, now we see the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Mesopotamia began in a country that was not named what it is today back when Mesopotamia was beginning. But it began in a country that nowadays we call Iraq, as you can see on the map there. And looking from space, man, is that ever dry, light brown colored. A picture from space doesn't lie. If it's light brown, it's a desert. But there's two rivers. I'll zoom in a little bit closer. That every year would overflow. And people discovered that the water that overflowed, when it sank and dried up, in that water was black soil, little particles floating around. And when that water dried up and went down into the earth, those particles of soil were left on the ground. And that black soil, even though it's in a desert, could be farmed, and plants could be grown in it, and they would survive. So in the heart of a desert, there's two rivers. They're called the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. I'm going to zoom in even further. And I love doing this because you can actually see from space that the original band or line that you thought was the river itself when we look at it from here isn't. But all this land, look at this. It's all dry and it's sandy and it's desert. And you zoom in on what you thought was the river itself because it looked dark, but it's not. Within this green strip of dark color is the river. In the heart of a desert, you see green soil, grass, fields of crops, and it's because of the river overflow and the soil that it leaves behind. It's the Euphrates River. The other one's called the Tigris. Maybe we can look at that, or maybe you can look at that on your own at some point. The two rivers are called the Euphrates and the Tigris. And most of Mesopotamia was in what's modern day Iraq. Now, even the word Mesopotamia itself means land between the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. These rivers run parallel. They follow the same direction. They run southeast from the mountains of Asia down into the Persian Gulf. And I think there's another picture that could be helpful in seeing this. Instead of satellite imagery, this one does a good job of showing you exactly where Mesopotamia was. You see the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, and that green color added to this map is to show that that's where plants could grow, that's where the civilization occurred, because without water, without food, you have no chance. And this happened. This was reality for the ancient people who moved into this area and settled down for good. And then we see the first civilization beginning. So, one last thing. What's a civilization? And I'm going to put a picture of a video game that I've never played, but looks fairly cool, and it probably is fun, and it's called Civilization. Now, during the Neolithic Age, small farming communities began. Roughly 50 to 100 to 200 people living in one place. They farmed, they domesticated animals. People could specialize and they had a surplus. But still, they're fairly small. A lot of times they didn't even have a leader. They still just worked together and cooperated. They didn't necessarily have laws that were written down because they didn't need them. They didn't have government. They didn't necessarily have a lot of art or religion. So Neolithic people got the ball rolling, but they're not a civilization. This is large building projects, large communities of thousands of people living together. This is an image of a Mesopotamian city. Obviously it's a drawing, so it's a reconstruction. But you see how much there was. A wall around the city. A large central place in the city, that's called a ziggurat, and there's more to come about that on a later touchcast. But that's civilization. There was a king, and there's belief systems, and there's laws, and there's education that's formal. And this is the first time in history that people started to live like this. It's really a lot like how we live right now. And to think about this way that we live being new is really cool. So, thanks for joining me on this introduction to Mesopotamia.